One morning, a girl named Mary, who was engaged to be married to a man named Joseph, was minding her own business when suddenly a great warrior of light appeared. He was Gabriel. He was an angel, and he was a special messenger from heaven. Mary, you are going to have a baby, a little boy. You will call him Jesus. He is God's own son. He is the one. He is the rescuer. Sure enough, it was just as the angel had said. 9 months later, Mary was almost ready to have her baby. Now Mary and Joseph had to take a trip to Bethlehem, the town King David was from. But when they reached the little town, they found every room was full. Every bed was taken. Where would they stay? Soon Mary's baby would come. They couldn't find anywhere except an old tumble-down stable, so they stayed where the cows and the donkeys and the horses stayed.
Thank you, Will. All right, good morning. Okay, so my name's Casey Toy. I am a member here at Sugar Grove, and I get the honor of reminding you of God's good news this morning. We're really glad that you're here with us, whether you're here in person or watching online. I'm usually not the one that's up here, as if you come here often, you know that. But Doug always says hi to his parents in Chicago, and I really hate to break tradition. So, good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Robinson. And then I would like to add a good morning, hi, Mom and Dad, to mine, who are watching in Denver. So, there you go. So, thank you, Will, so much for reading for us today, and thank you, Julia, for sharing your story. I feel like you could have just preached this morning, Julia. We're currently in a series that's called With Us, and it's all about how the Christmas story tells us that God is with us in the reality of our fallen world. Jesus, in his birth story, is already participating in our story, walking through that hard stuff. And last week, Doug used the image of how God is with us in the big picture and in the small picture. He talked about how big picture, Jesus came to be our rescuer from sin, to rescue all of humanity, to bring us back into relationship with God. And small picture, how God is with us in the details of our lives. He talked about Mary and Joseph and how they faced this very unplanned, unexpected, unwed pregnancy. And God was still with them in the time of your lives when you feel out of control and things are not going as planned. So since Doug covered the conception and Jesus' earthly family, I get to talk about Jesus' actual arrival, which feels very appropriate since I have had experience with that. The tension that we're going to look at today is rejection, and how Jesus' entire life is a story of rejection, and it starts right at his birth story. So we're going to explore the idea of rejection and how God is with us both at the big picture level and the small picture level. We're going to start by reading Luke 2, 1 through 7. If you have your Bible, please feel free to follow along, or the verses will be on the screen for you. Sticky, sorry. All right, so Luke 2, 1 through 7. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in the manger because there was no guest room available for them. Okay, so I want to start by talking small picture. Verse 3 says that everyone goes to their own town to register. And then verse 4 tells us that Joseph is going there because he belonged to the house and line of David. So right there, we see that there should be no rejection, right? This is his own town. He belongs to this place because of his ancestors, right? This little family should be in Bethlehem. But it gives us an explanation of why they're not fully accepted there, right? Jesus has to be laid in a manger because there's no guest room available for them. So I was wondering, why? Right, so traditionally this verse is translated from Greek as no room in the inn. But I did some research, and I am definitely not a Greek scholar in any way. But other Greek scholars have decided that guest room actually fits better than inn. But for me, when I read that, I was like, oh, that makes the rejection worse. Right, to have an innkeeper be like, sorry, there's just no room for you. That feels like, okay, it's business. But to have somebody be like, no, you can't stay in our guest room. Sorry. That feels more personal. So I tried to think, why in the world would people not have wanted them in their guest room? Maybe it's just that they were late, right? All the guest rooms were taken. I've been pregnant twice, and there is no moving fast at the end of that pregnancy, right? So, if Mary and Joseph just take a long time to get there, fair enough, okay? But still, you would think somebody that was that pregnant could get a guest room. So it's probably just that they weren't important enough, right? Despite the fact that they're family, despite the fact that Mary is so vulnerable this far along in her pregnancy, despite the fact that this is the Son of God, there was no room for them. Jesus is born into a situation where his little life has already been deemed second best to whoever is in the guest room. And that really made me think of the movie Forrest Gump. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, it's about a man named Forrest Gump and how he grows from his childhood all the way through his adulthood. And in childhood, he has metal braces put on his legs, and there are some kids who make fun of him for this. And there's this very iconic scene where Forrest Gump gets onto the school bus for his first day of school. And he should be there, right? He is a student going to school. But as he walks down that aisle, all these kids in their Alabama accents look at him, put their hands on their seats, and say, "Seats taken." Right? There's no room for you, Forrest. Have you heard that before? That there's no room for you? That you're too late? That you're not important enough? That you're too different? That you've done too much? That you're too whatever or not enough of this? Man, rejection from people, it hurts. And as much as I wish that I could tell you today that when you follow Jesus, you'll no longer face rejection, I just can't, because Jesus promises us the exact opposite. In John 15:18, he tells his disciples, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. He knows that feeling of rejection more intimately and deeply than most of us will ever know. And this is part of the small picture, that Jesus knows what it is to truly be human. We can turn to him in pain and confusion and anger of rejection because he knows. He sees you. He understands deeply, and because of that, he can comfort you deeply. At this point, you might be thinking, wow, I'm really glad that Doug asked Casey to come and preach a Christmas sermon about how I'm going to be rejected in my life. Joy to the world. But I would say, wait, that's the small picture. Let's talk about the big picture and how God is with us in this rejection. So in order to do that, we're going to have to zoom out and talk about God's narrative with humanity and when this all started. In the beginning, God created the world and everything in it, including people, and he saw that it was good. He walks in the garden with Adam and Eve. Humanity is in communion with God. Right? And everything is just as it should be. God gives Adam and Eve everything they need, rule over all the plants and animals and creation. But he sets up a boundary, and he says, hey, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because at this point, humans don't have knowledge of evil. I'm going to pick up here in the Jesus Storybook Bible. That's what Will read from us earlier, and I love this. I read it with my kids all the time. But I think it does a really good job of explaining this. So, God had a horrible enemy. His name was Satan. Satan had once been the most beautiful angel, but he didn't want to be just an angel. He wanted to be God. He grew proud and evil and full of hate, and God had to send him out of heaven. Satan was seething with anger and looking for a way to hurt God. He wanted to stop God's plan, stop the love story right here. So he disguised himself as a snake and waited in the garden. As soon as the snake saw his chance, he slithered silently up to Eve. Does God really love you? The serpent whispered. If he does, why won't he let you eat the nice, juicy, delicious fruit? Poor you. Perhaps God doesn't want you to be happy. The snake's words hissed into her ears and sunk down deep into her heart like poison. Does God love me? Eve wondered. Suddenly, she didn't know anymore. Just trust me, the serpent whispered. You don't need God. One small taste, that's all, and you'll be happier than you can ever dream. Eve picked the fruit and ate some. Adam ate some too. And a terrible lie came into the world. It would never leave. It would live on in every human heart, whispering to every one of God's children, God doesn't love me. So this is the start of rejection between God and humans. Except hopefully you noticed it wasn't God rejecting us. It was us rejecting him. This rejection separated us from who we were meant to be, God's children. Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. But in the same moment that they are expelled, God tells them, I have a plan to bring you back. And the whole rest of the Bible is God's plan to bring humanity back into communion with him. And that rescue plan, as Doug told us last week, is all about the rescuer, Jesus. You see, Jesus came to rescue us from ourselves, from our sin, from our own rejection of love. And the best part is that he came to rescue everyone. The Jewish people envisioned this rescue culminating in a big feast that they referred to as the Messianic Feast. The Messiah was going to come and set all things right and then throw this delicious, gigantic meal for everyone. I know Doug is hoping there's chips and queso there, and I have no doubt that there will be. Isaiah 25, 6-8 describes the Messianic feast like this. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. Did you notice the alls in this passage? I read it and I was just like, man, that stuck out to me, right? This feast is for all peoples. We're not talking the cool ones, the accepted ones, the righteous ones, the got it all together ones, the born into the right family ones. No, there is no qualifier, just the word all. Jesus himself tells us in John 3:17, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Jesus didn't come to condemn us, guys, not to point out the ways that we've messed up, but to point out that God still loves us. God knows that we can't take back the rejection. He knows we're not capable of rooting out the evil that just sinks down deep into us and separates us from God. But he also knows that he is capable. And so Jesus came to rescue us, to restore us, not to reject us. Jesus himself talks about this messianic feast in Luke 14. And when he tells this story, he's eating a Sabbath meal at the Pharisee's house, which means that he's eating with a whole bunch of people who know all the Jewish laws, all the customs, and who really think they know all of the answers. And one of Jesus' favorite pastimes was to set the Pharisees straight on what they thought was going to be. Okay, so the Pharisees have spent most of their lives rejecting people, setting up these standards, these rules, these traditions, and pointing out like, oh, sorry, you messed up, you're out. All right? They want to control God's salvation. But Jesus wants to let them know exactly who is invited to this messianic feast, which is his own feast. All right, so we're going to pick up in Luke 14, starting in verse 15. When one of those at the table was with him heard this, heard this meaning they were talking about the resurrection of the dead, when the Messiah comes back. He said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God," right, the messianic feast. And Jesus replied, right, let me tell you about this messianic feast. A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready." All right, so these Pharisees would have been like tracking that he's talking about the Messianic feast, would have understood that the certain man preparing the banquet is God, and the people who have received the invitations, they would assume would be themselves, the Israelites, okay? But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said, "I've just bought a field and I must go see it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me." Still another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." The servant came back and reported this to his master, and the owner of the house became angry. I want to pause here because this is some really intense and obvious rejection, right? Who buys a field without seeing it first? Who buys 5 yoke of oxen without making sure they can pull on the yoke? Right? Like, this is basically like, "Sorry, I gotta wash my hair." Okay? Like, they're rejecting this feast thrower, right? So he orders his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town. Bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. Bring in everyone else that has been rejected. They get to come." "Sir," the servant said, "what you ordered has been done, but there's still room." There's a lot of room at God's table. And the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and country lanes, compel them to come in so that my house will be full." Right? Everybody that you can get your hands on, all the people get this invitation. Come to the feast. I tell you, not one of those who are invited will get a taste of my banquet. So as I was studying this parable, I got 2 big things from it. The first is that we are invited to the banquet even when men reject us. Right? These are people that he's calling in that usually don't get the invitation. So if you feel left out, scorned, less than, know that God's invitation is for you. And that no man's opinion of you takes away God's desire to see you sit at his table. Second, and most importantly, that once again, it's not God who's doing the rejecting, it's us. It's the ones with the invitation who reject the feast. And he spells out the consequence of that rejection, right? Like, if you choose not to come to the feast, you're not coming to the feast. But it's us who made that choice and not him. And this really stopped me because this is twice that God has given me a scripture where it's humanity rejecting God and not the other way around. And I had to stop because, guys, I have spent most of my life feeling rejected by God. And I know a lot of people do. Rejection from God can feel like a diagnosis, a divorce, a death, a loss of a job, an injustice, a loss of a dream. For me, it felt like a daily personal rejection of who I am. Somewhere in my childhood, this belief began to take root deep inside of me that God's love and grace was for everyone but me. That I actually wasn't covered by Jesus because I grew up in the church. So I should know better, so my sin doesn't fall under the umbrella that Jesus takes away rejection. It's for everyone but me. And this belief began to grow and flower and blossom inside me, digging roots down deeper every day, and it affected every single part of my life. You better try harder, Casey, because it's not good enough. It began to be the drumbeat of my heart that I heard day in and day out. You're not enough. Work harder. It's not enough. During 2nd grade, I started to have meltdowns, experiences where I couldn't function. All I could do was cry because it was being screamed into my ear, it's not enough. Work harder. And man, it's debilitating when you know you're being rejected because you deserve it. And I do, man. I'm a sinner. I spent the majority of my school years very high functioning, always working harder to be better, only melting down with the pain and fear of rejection occasionally. Some years were a lot harder than others. Middle school was real great. 5th grade was actually one of my harder years. I had lots of medical tests because of stomach ulcers. I had to be switched out schools. After a really embarrassing meltdown my junior year of college that happened in front of my then boyfriend, Jason Toy, I was advised by my really wise mother to finally go see a counselor. And it was there that she tapped into this belief that had woven itself into every aspect of my life. I believed that God truly didn't love me or want me. But here's the thing about my story. That's a lie. The truth is, I am a sinner. But God, who is rich in mercy and grace, loves me. And Jesus came to give me an invitation to join his table. He invites me to be his child. There is room for me with him. The last 10 years of my life have been a big healing journey, and God has to remind me of the truth daily, and I need it because I really easily fall back into this lie. But he gently reveals his love for me, and it always amazes me. And everywhere that I look in Scripture, I find evidence of his relentless pursuit to offer sinners an invitation to come to his table, to commune with him once again. We do not serve a God of rejection, but one of reconciliation. Just as Jesus talked about how he's going to hand out these invitations to everyone that he can find. That's big picture, right? Here, the Messianic feast is for all people. But then he also tells this story on the small picture about a dad who has 2 sons. I want us to read this, and even though this parable is about 2 sons, I'm just going to focus on the first one. We're in Luke 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus continued. Also, he's continuing because the Pharisees told him, "Stop eating and hanging out with sinners. It's bad. Don't do it." So Jesus tells 3 stories about how God feels about hanging out with sinners. So this is the 3rd story that he's continuing. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Rejection. Right? That son is rejecting his dad so much he doesn't want to stay in the same town as him. He wants to get out of the country with his dad. And then he squanders all of the hard work that his dad built. And he squanders it in wild living. So he is not only rejecting his dad, he's rejecting his dad's values and culture. This is harsh. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I've rejected you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.'" He gets it, right? Rejection has consequences. It breaks relationships. It is hard to accept someone who has straight up rejected you. He knows, I don't deserve any acceptance back. And he really doesn't. But he got up and he went to his father. Here's the good news, guys. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Guys, we have all chosen to leave God. We have all chosen to live the way that we want, and we all deserve the consequences of that choice. But we serve a God who runs to us when we choose him. Guys, we serve a God who throws a giant party and celebrates when we accept him. He is waiting to bring you back into the family, not waiting to point out your mistakes. So come back. He loves you. So may we, this Christmas season, see the celebration of Christ's birth as the invitation that it is, that we are invited to turn away from this rejection and turn instead to his acceptance. May you spend this Christmas season knowing that he is with us, and nothing that you have done or haven't done, will do or won't do, is enough to disqualify you from his invitation.